"No one will touch you here," American black soldiers protected Japanese comfort women from abuse. The salt spray stung Emiko's eyes as she huddled with the other women in the ship's cramped hold. The metal floor beneath them creaked and groaned with each wave, a constant reminder of their journey into uncertainty. 23 women, all former comfort women, sat shoulder to shoulder, their wrists bound with rough rope that chafed their skin raw. Emiko's stomach churned, but not from the rolling waves. The whispered stories about American soldiers, especially the black soldiers, echoed in her mind. The Imperial officers had painted terrifying pictures of brutal savages who would show no mercy to Japanese prisoners. "They will treat us worse than animals," whispered Yuri, her voice trembling. She was the youngest among them, barely 17. "The black demons will... quiet." A Japanese guard's sharp command cut through the air, followed by the thud of his rifle butt against the metal wall. The women flinched in unison, a learned response from years of abuse. Emiko closed her eyes, trying to find a moment of peace in the darkness behind her eyelids. The familiar weight of shame pressed down on her shoulders. Shame for what she'd been forced to do. Shame for surviving when others hadn't. The gentle swaying of the ship brought back memories of her childhood home in Osaka, of her mother's garden and the wind chimes that once sang in the spring breeze. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now. A sudden change in the ship's movement jolted her back to reality. The engine's rhythm shifted, and new sounds filtered down from above. Shouted orders, heavy footsteps, the screech of metal against metal. "We're docking," someone whispered. The temperature dropped noticeably as they approached land. One by one, the guards distributed heavy coats to the women. Even this simple act was performed roughly, the garments thrown at them with disdain. Emiko helped Yuri into her coat, her bound hands making the task difficult. "Remember what we were told," one of the older women murmured. "Keep your eyes down. Don't speak unless spoken to. Maybe they will move." The guard's command silenced all conversation. The women were herded up the narrow stairs, emerging into a bitter wind that cut through their coats like knives. Emiko's first glimpse of America was a gray sky and the looming presence of Camp McCoy. The wind carried strange scents, pine trees, snow, and something burning in the distance, so different from home, so alien. Her legs shook as she descended the gangplank, partly from weeks at sea and partly from terror. Through lowered lashes, she caught glimpses of the American soldiers standing at attention. Their uniforms were crisp, their postures rigid. Many of them were black, their dark skin a stark contrast to their white counterparts. Emiko's heart pounded harder. Everything she'd been told about these men played through her mind like a horror story. The cold bit deeper as they were led across the dock. None of the women dared to look up, their steps small and hesitant. Emiko could feel the weight of the American soldiers' stares. She thought of all the men who had looked at her that way before, all the pain that had followed those looks. Her throat tightened with unshed tears. Surely this new captivity would be no different from the last. The Americans might wear different uniforms, speak a different language, but men were men. The war had taught her that much. As they were led toward the camp's entrance, Emiko offered a silent prayer to whatever gods might still be listening. Not for herself. She had stopped praying for herself long ago. But for Yuri and the other younger women. They had already endured so much. How much more could any of them take? Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. The wooden planks of the dock creaked under Emiko's feet as she stepped onto American soil. Her legs felt weak after weeks at sea, and the cold Wisconsin wind bit through her thin coat. Around her, the other women huddled close, their shoulders hunched against both the cold and their fears. A tall American officer approached them, his uniform crisp despite the bitter wind. His insignia marked him as a colonel, and his bearing commanded attention. Emiko kept her eyes lowered, as she had been taught, but she couldn't help stealing glances at this man who would determine their fate. "I am Colonel Harris," he announced, his voice carrying across the dock. A Japanese interpreter, standing beside him, translated his words. "You are now under the protection of the United States Army and the Geneva Convention." Emiko's heart skipped a beat. Protection? The word seemed foreign, after everything they had endured. She risked a look at the other women's faces, and saw her own confusion mirrored there. "You will be treated with dignity and respect," Colonel Harris continued, his tone firm but not unkind. "No one will harm you here. You will receive proper food, medical care, and shelter. In return, we expect you to follow the camp rules. The interpreter's words washed over them, and Emiko felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps the smallest crack in her wall of fear. The colonel's manner was so different from what they had been told to expect. Where was the brutality they had been warned about? "Follow Lieutenant Johnson," Colonel Harris instructed, gesturing to a black officer standing nearby. "He will escort you to your quarters." As they walked through the camp, Emiko's legs trembled with each step. The gravel crunched beneath their feet, and she could smell pine trees in the distance. Everything felt strange. The wooden buildings, the wide spaces between them, the neat paths. Lieutenant Johnson led them to a long, low building. "These are your barracks?" he explained through the interpreter. Inside, the floor was swept clean, and neat rows of beds lined the walls. Each bed had a thin but clean mattress, blankets, and a small pillow. "Each of you will have your own bed," Lieutenant Johnson said. His voice was gentle, almost kind. "There are washrooms at the end of the building. You'll receive your meal schedules and camp regulations tomorrow morning." Emiko watched as the women were assigned their beds one by one. The mattress felt soft under her hand as she touched it, so different from the hardship bunks they'd endured for weeks. Sunlight filtered through small windows, casting warm rectangles on the wooden floor. Outside, she could hear male voices, American soldiers talking and laughing as they went about their duties. The sound made some of the women tense, but there was something different about it. These weren't the harsh, threatening voices they had known before. As Emiko sat on her assigned bed, she noticed small details that seemed out of place in a prison. Hooks for hanging clothes, a shelf for personal belongings, even a small mirror on one wall. Everything was simple but clean and orderly. She watched as the other women began to settle in, their movements cautious but less rigid than before. Some sat on their beds, running their hands over the blankets as if they couldn't believe they were real. Others stood near the windows, peering out at their new surroundings with uncertain eyes. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath Emiko as she sat cross-legged on her thin mattress. Night had fallen over Camp McCoy, and the barracks settled into an uneasy quiet. Around her, the other women whispered softly to each other, their voices barely louder than the winter wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. Emiko pulled her scratchy blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to ward off the Wisconsin cold. It was different from the humid heat of the Pacific, where she'd spent the last 3 years. Her mind wandered back to the training sessions, where stern-faced officers had drilled into them the savage nature of the American enemy. "They are barbarians," the officers had said. "Especially the black ones. They're like animals." She glanced around at her fellow comfort women. Some were crying softly, while others stared blankly at the ceiling. Keiko, the youngest at barely 17, huddled close to Emiko for warmth. Despite the harsh conditions, there was something comforting about being together. They had survived so much already. "Maybe it won't be so bad here," Keiko whispered in Japanese, her voice trembling. "The commander didn't seem cruel." Emiko shook her head. "Don't be fooled," she replied quietly. "Remember what we were taught. They're just trying to lower our guard." But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her mind. The American soldiers' behavior so far hadn't matched anything she'd been told to expect. The sound of boots on the wooden steps outside made all the women freeze. Their bodies tensed automatically, a learned response from years of abuse. The door opened slowly, and a tall black soldier entered, carrying a large pot and some bowls. "Good evening," he said softly in English, his voice gentle and warm. "I'm Private Harris. I brought you some hot soup. You must be hungry after your journey." Emiko watched him carefully, searching for signs of the brutality she'd been warned about. Instead, she saw only kindness in his eyes as he carefully set down the pot and began ladling soup into bowls. His movements were deliberate and slow, as if he understood their fear and wanted to show them they had nothing to worry about. "I'll be working with you in the medical unit," Private Harris continued, handing out the bowls one by one. He didn't thrust them at the women or throw them as Emiko had expected. Instead, he waited patiently for each woman to reach out and take a bowl. "Some of you might need medical attention. I'm here to help." When he reached Emiko, their eyes met briefly. She saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. Not pity, but understanding. He spoke to her as an equal, not as a conquered enemy or a thing to be used. The simple humanity in his gesture as he handed her the bowl made her hands tremble. The soup was warm and smelled of vegetables and chicken. It was more food than they'd seen in weeks. Private Harris stood back, giving them space as they began to eat. He didn't leer or make demands. He didn't treat them like spoils of war. Emiko's spoon shook as she tried to reconcile this reality with everything she'd been taught. The Imperial Army's words echoed in her head, but they rang hollow against the evidence before her. This man, this enemy she'd been trained to fear, showed more dignity and respect than any of her supposed protectors had in years. The confusion in her heart grew with each passing moment. Nothing made sense anymore. Her world, with its clear divisions between friend and foe, was crumbling around her. The mess hall's double doors creaked open, and Emiko's stomach tightened. The familiar smell of cooked rice wafted through the air, mixed with unfamiliar aromas that made her mouth water despite her anxiety. She shuffled forward with the other women, their footsteps echoing in the large room. The serving line stretched before them, steam rising from metal containers. Emiko's hands trembled as she accepted the plain metal tray from a young black soldier. She kept her eyes down, remembering the harsh words and cruel treatment she'd endured before, but the soldier simply smiled and gestured toward the food. "Please, help yourself," he said softly. Emiko blinked in surprise. The portions were generous. A mound of white rice, vegetables she recognized, and some kind of meat stew. Her hands shook as she moved down the line. This had to be some kind of trick. In her experience, good food meant someone wanted something in return. The other women whispered among themselves in Japanese as they found seats at one of the long tables. "It smells so good," Yuri murmured, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Don't trust it," another woman warned. "Remember what they told us about Americans." Emiko sat down carefully, studying the food on her tray. The rice was properly cooked, not the half-raw grains they'd been given on the ship. The vegetables were fresh, not wilted and spoiled. The meat stew had real pieces of beef floating in the rich broth. She watched the black soldiers moving about the mess hall, their manner relaxed but professional. None of them leered or made crude gestures. None shouted or threatened. It was so different from what she'd been taught to expect that she felt dizzy with confusion. A young woman next to her took a small bite of the stew and made a quiet sound of pleasure. "It's good," she whispered, as if afraid someone would snatch the food away for daring to enjoy it. Emiko picked up her spoon, the metal cool against her palm. The stew was indeed good, rich and flavorful, with tender meat that practically melted in her mouth. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had such a satisfying meal. The sound of boots approaching made her tense. A tall black soldier in a sergeant's uniform stopped near their table. Emiko recognized the stripes on his sleeve. Sergeant Thomas, one of the senior officers they'd seen earlier. Her hand tightened on her spoon, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But Sergeant Thomas simply gave them a polite nod, his expression kind. "I hope the food is to your satisfaction," he said in a deep, gentle voice. "You are protected here under the Geneva Convention. No one will harm you." He spoke the words with such simple sincerity that Emiko felt her eyes burn with unexpected tears. She blinked them back quickly, not wanting to show weakness. But the sergeant's words echoed in her mind, challenging everything she'd been taught about Americans, especially Black Americans. The other women at the table had gone very still, their expressions a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. Yuri's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and Emiko could see them trembling slightly. "Thank you," Emiko managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Sergeant Thomas nodded again and moved on, leaving them to their meal. The women ate in silence, but Emiko could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The food was warm in their bellies, and the sergeant's words were warm in their hearts, beginning to thaw the frozen fear they'd carried for so long. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp McCoy as Emiko sat on the edge of her bunk, watching through the window. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. Outside, American soldiers moved with purpose, their boots crunching on the gravel paths between buildings. She had expected to see chaos and cruelty, the kind she had witnessed for years under Japanese control. Instead, the black soldiers walked in neat lines, their uniforms clean and pressed. They carried clipboards and equipment, speaking in low voices as they went about their duties. "Look at them," she whispered in Japanese to Yuri, who sat nearby. "They move like they have somewhere important to be." A soldier passed by their window, and Emiko instinctively drew back. But he merely nodded and said, "Good morning, ladies." The simple greeting made her chest tight with confusion. Throughout the morning she observed more unexpected behavior. The soldiers didn't shout or threaten. They didn't leer at the women or make crude gestures. When one of the younger girls dropped her bowl at breakfast, a nearby soldier simply helped her clean it up and brought her a new one. "This must be some kind of trick," Emiko muttered, more to convince herself than anyone else. But doubt had begun to creep in, like water seeping through cracks in a wall. At midday, Sergeant Thomas gathered the women in the common area. Emiko's muscles tensed, waiting for the other shoe to drop. This would be it, the moment when the facade of kindness would crack. "Ladies," he said through an interpreter, "you'll be working in the camp's laundry facility." He gestured to a low building nearby. "Standard shifts. Proper equipment provided. You'll be shown how to operate everything safely." Emiko translated his words in her head again and again, certain she must have misunderstood. But then they were led to the laundry room, where clean work dresses waited for them. No rags, no torn clothes, actual proper workwear. Inside, the laundry room was warm and well lit. Steam rose from large washing machines, and clotheslines crisscrossed the back area. A young black soldier named Private Harris demonstrated how to use the equipment, his movements careful and deliberate. "These machines are hot," he explained through the interpreter. "Please be careful. If you need help, just ask." He smiled, and Emiko noticed how his eyes crinkled at the corners. Kind eyes, nothing like the cruel faces she'd grown accustomed to. The work was straightforward, almost peaceful. No one screamed at them. No one struck them for working too slowly. When one of the machines made an odd noise, Private Harris rushed to fix it himself rather than blame them. That night, Emiko lay in her bunk, her mind racing. The day's events refused to align with everything she'd been taught about Americans, especially Black Americans. The Imperial Army had painted them as savage, cruel, and less than human. Yet these men treated them with more dignity than she'd known in years. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, her dreams were filled with shadows from her past. The horror of the comfort stations, the faces of Japanese officers who had treated her like property. But now, for the first time, those memories seemed to crack around the edges, letting in slivers of doubt about everything she'd been forced to believe. She woke with tears on, her cheeks, her heart pounding, questioning every truth she'd thought she knew about her captors, about the war, about herself. The sunset painted long shadows across the wooden floor of the barracks. Emiko sat on her thin mattress, her back straight despite her exhaustion. Around her, the other women were settling in for the night, their movements quiet and hesitant, as if they were still afraid to make too much noise. Through the walls came the distant whistle of a train, its lonely sound cutting through the evening air. The soft murmur of American soldiers talking outside filtered in through the windows, their deep voices a constant reminder of where they were. But it wasn't the harsh, commanding tone they had grown used to, just normal conversation, punctuated by occasional laughter. Mrs. Tanaka, an older woman from Osaka, folded her blanket with trembling hands. "I keep waiting," she whispered in Japanese, her voice barely audible, waiting for them to show their true. Emiko watched as several other women nodded in agreement. They had all been taught the same things about Americans, especially about the black soldiers. They had been told stories of their brutality, their savagery, but today had shattered everything they thought they knew. The memory of Private Harris bringing them breakfast that morning played in her mind. He had smiled, not a cruel smile, but a genuine one, and made sure everyone had enough to eat. When young Keiko had dropped her bowl, he hadn't shouted or struck her. Instead, he had helped clean up the mess and brought her a new serving. "Perhaps," Emiko said softly, "what we were told was wrong." The words felt strange in her mouth, almost forbidden. Several women looked at her with wide eyes. Outside, footsteps approached their barracks. Every woman tensed, their bodies remembering years of abuse and fear. But it was just the evening patrol passing by, their boots making a steady rhythm on the packed earth. They didn't stop. They didn't burst in. They just continued their rounds. Yuki, who slept in the bunk below Emiko's, pulled her knees to her chest. "I keep thinking about what Sergeant Thomas said today," she murmured, "about being protected by the Geneva Convention. I didn't know such rules existed. Neither had Emiko. In all her years of service to the Empire, no one had ever mentioned rules about treating prisoners with dignity. The concept seemed foreign, like something from another world. As night settled fully over the camp, the women prepared for bed. Some said quiet prayers, others simply lay down in silence. The routine was familiar, but the atmosphere was different. There was no need to stay alert for approaching footsteps, no reason to fear the dark. Emiko climbed into her bunk, the thin mattress creaking under her weight. She lay back, staring at the wooden beams above her head. Her mind wandered to her family's home in Kyoto, to the cherry trees that would be blooming soon. She thought about her younger sister, about the day she had been taken away to serve the empire. For years, fear had been her constant companion. Fear of the officers, fear of punishment, fear of death. It had become so much a part of her that she hardly noticed it anymore. Until now, when its absence left her feeling strangely light. Tonight, something was different. The familiar weight of dread didn't press down on her chest. Instead, there was a small, fragile feeling growing in its place. It reminded her of spring mornings in Kyoto, of new buds pushing through the soil. It was hope, tentative and delicate, but unmistakably there. The rhythmic sound of boots on gravel pulled Emiko from her restless sleep. Through the barracks' small window, the pale morning light cast long shadows across the wooden floor. Her muscles ached from the thin mattress, but it was still more comfortable than anything she'd slept on in months. "They're going to send us to work camps," Yuki whispered from the bunk beside her. "Just like before." Her voice trembled with the memory of their past experiences. Emiko sat up slowly, watching the other women stir in their bunks. The fear in their eyes was familiar. She saw it in her own reflection every morning. Across the room, Sakura hugged her knees to her chest, rocking slightly. "I heard them talking about moving us." Another woman, May, added, "What if this kindness is just temporary?" Her words hung heavy in the morning air. The marching outside grew louder, then faded. Emiko's hands twisted in her lap as she listened to the women's worried whispers. The Americans had shown them nothing but respect so far, but old fears died hard. She remembered Private Harris's gentle manner when bringing them food, so different from what they'd been told to expect. "Maybe they just want us healthy before they—" Yuki couldn't finish her sentence. A knock at the door made them all jump. Lieutenant Johnson stood in the doorway, his dark uniform pressed and neat. Behind him, Private Harris held a clipboard. "Good morning, ladies," Lieutenant Johnson said, his voice steady and calm. "I have news about your assignments." Emiko felt her stomach tighten. This was it, the moment they'd all been dreading. Around her, the women drew closer together, seeking comfort in their proximity. "You'll be transferred to the medical unit," he continued. "We need support staff, and those of you with any medical experience will be particularly valuable." Private Harris stepped forward. "We'll provide training for those who need it. You'll be helping our medical team care for injured soldiers and other prisoners." Emiko translated for the women who couldn't understand English. Their reactions were a mix of disbelief and suspicion. Medical work? Training? It seemed too good to be true. "When do we start?" Emiko asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow morning," Lieutenant Johnson replied. "Get some rest today." "Private. Harris will escort you to the medical unit at 0800 hours. After they left, the barracks erupted in hushed conversations. Emiko sat on her bunk, trying to make sense of it all. The medical unit meant clean work, respect, responsibility. But her mind kept circling back to darker possibilities. "What if they're lying?" Yuki asked, voicing what many were thinking. "What if this is just another way to use us?" Emiko stared at her hands, remembering all the promises that had been broken before. The Americans seemed different. Their actions so far had shown that. But years of abuse and betrayal had taught her to be wary of hope. "We should be careful," she finally said, looking around at the worried faces of her companions. "But maybe this time it's real." The women fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the camp continued its morning routine. Voices calling out, vehicles rumbling past, the flag snapping in the wind. Emiko closed her eyes, trying to find certainty in a world that had given her so little reason to trust. The morning sun filtered through the medical unit's windows as Emiko and the other women lined up for their first day of work. The antiseptic smell reminded her of hospitals back home, but there was something different here, a calmness that seemed out of place in a military facility. Lieutenant Johnson stood before them, his uniform crisp and neat. His voice was steady and gentle as he explained their duties. "You'll be helping us maintain supplies, sterilize equipment, and assist with basic patient care," he said, making eye contact with each woman in turn. "We value your help here." Emiko's hands trembled slightly as she arranged medical supplies on a metal tray. She kept stealing glances at Lieutenant Johnson, waiting for the mask to slip, for the kindness to fade into the cruelty she had come to expect from men in uniform. But it never did. Throughout the morning, he showed them how to properly organize the Shodia Dude. Medical supplies, his movements deliberate and patient. When Emiko dropped a roll of bandages, she flinched, expecting harsh words or worse. Instead, Lieutenant Johnson simply picked it up and handed it back to her with a small smile. "It takes time to learn new things," he said softly. "Don't worry about mistakes." The other women watched this interaction with wide eyes, their own tensions visible in their rigid postures and quick, nervous movements. But as the hours passed, their shoulders began to relax, just a little. During their lunch break, Emiko observed Lieutenant Johnson speaking with other soldiers. She noticed how some white officers barely acknowledged him, turning their backs or walking away mid-conversation. Yet he maintained his dignity, his head held high despite the obvious slights. The afternoon brought more training. Lieutenant Johnson demonstrated how to properly fold sterile linens, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness. Emiko worked alongside him, and gradually, her fear began to mix with curiosity. How could this man, who faced such clear disdain from his fellow soldiers, show such kindness to them, the enemy? As the day drew to a close and the other women filed out, Lieutenant Johnson gestured for Emiko to stay behind. Her heart raced, old fears surfacing, but she forced herself to remain still. "Miss Emiko," he said, pulling up 2 chairs. "Please, sit." She perched on the edge of the chair, watching as he settled into his own seat with a tired sigh. "I see how you watch us, the fear in your eyes," he began, his voice low and thoughtful. "I want to tell you something about myself." He paused, looking down at his hands. "Back home, I can't even drink from the same water fountain as white folks. Here in the army, I command men in battle, but some won't salute me because of the color of my skin." Emiko's eyes widened as he continued. "Every day, I fight 2 wars, one against the enemy, and one against the prejudice in my own ranks. But I refuse to let their hatred make me cruel. I refuse to become what they think I am." His words struck something deep within Emiko. She saw in his eyes a pain she recognized, the pain of being seen as less than human. For the first time, she truly looked at him, not as an American soldier, but as a person carrying his own heavy burdens. "I tell you this," he said, meeting her gaze, "because I want you to understand. I know what it's like to be judged, to be feared, to be treated as less than human. That will never happen to you here. Not while I'm in charge." The morning sun filtered through the medical unit's windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Emiko moved between the rows of shelves, organizing medical supplies with methodical precision. Her fingers traced the labels on the bottles, matching them with the English words she was slowly learning. The routine had become familiar over the past few days, but the workload was heavy. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she stretched to reach a high shelf. The box of bandages she held wobbled precariously in her hands. Her muscles ached from the constant lifting and sorting. "Let me help you with that," a gentle voice said behind her. Emiko turned to find Private Harris standing there, his kind eyes meeting hers. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, allowing him to take the heavy box from her hands. "Thank you," she said softly, the English words still feeling strange on her tongue. Private Harris placed the box on the shelf with ease. "No need to strain yourself," he said, smiling. "We're all here to help each other." As they worked side by side, Emiko noticed how Private Harris moved with careful consideration, always giving her space, never making sudden movements that might startle her. He hummed quietly as he worked, a peaceful melody that filled the silence between them. During their lunch break, they sat on wooden crates in the storage room, sharing the simple meal provided by the camp kitchen. The other women had gone to eat in the mess hall, but Emiko had stayed behind to finish her work. Private Harris had chosen to keep her company. "Why?" Emiko asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Her voice trembled slightly. "Why do you treat me, with such kindness?" Private Harris set down his cup of water, considering her question carefully. "Back home," he began, his voice soft but steady. "I know what it's like to be treated as less than human, to have people look at you and see only what they want to see." He paused, meeting her gaze. "No soldier deserves that. No person deserves that." Emiko's hands tightened around her tin cup. "But we were your enemies," she whispered. "The war's over for you," he replied. "And dignity. Well, that's something every person should have, regardless of where they come from or what color their skin is." He smiled gently. "I've seen enough hatred in this world. Kindness is a choice I make every day." His words settled deep in Emiko's heart. She looked at Private Harris, really looked at him, and saw not the monster she'd been taught to fear, but a man who understood pain and chose kindness anyway. The realization brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she said again, but this time the words carried the weight of true gratitude. Private Harris nodded, understanding in his eyes. They returned to their work, but something had shifted. The medical supplies still needed sorting, the day's tasks still needed completion, but Emiko moved through them with a lighter heart. For the first time since arriving at Camp McCoy, she felt truly seen as a person, not just a prisoner of war. Emiko's head felt heavy as she tried to get out of bed that morning. Her limbs ached, and sweat dampened her forehead despite the cool air. She stumbled slightly as she attempted to stand, catching herself on the edge of her bunk. "Are you all right?" One of the other women whispered, noticing her unsteady movements. Before Emiko could answer, the room began to spin. She sat back down hard on her bed, her vision blurring at the edges. The last thing she remembered was someone calling for help. When she opened her eyes again, she was in the camp's medical unit. The clean, antiseptic smell filled her nose, and crisp white sheets covered her trembling body. Private Harris stood nearby, his face etched with concern as he spoke with one of the camp doctors. "Her fever's running high," the doctor said, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead. "We'll need to monitor her closely." Private Harris nodded, his usually cheerful expression replaced by worry. "I'll stay with her," he said firmly. "Make sure she has everything she needs." Emiko watched through half-closed eyes as the medical staff moved efficiently around her. They checked her temperature, administered medicine, and kept her comfortable. Private Harris remained close by, occasionally offering her sips of water or adjusting her pillows. The fever made her drift in and out of consciousness. During her lucid moments, she noticed how the soldiers worked together seamlessly, their movements practiced and professional. There was no hesitation in their care, no sign that they viewed her as anything less than a patient in need. Private Harris spoke to her softly when she was awake, his voice steady and reassuring. "You're going to be just fine," he said, helping her sit up to take some medicine. "We've got the best medical team here." Through her feverish haze, Emiko remembered the stories she'd been told about American soldiers, tales of brutality and callousness. But here she was, receiving careful attention from these same men who were supposed to be her enemies. The contrast between what she'd been taught and what she was experiencing struck her deeply. As the day wore on, other soldiers from the medical unit came to check on her. They treated her with the same professional care they would show any patient, regardless of their background or nationality. Their gentle hands and kind words further challenged everything she'd believed about American soldiers. The fever finally broke in the evening. Emiko's mind cleared, and she found herself looking at Private Harris with new eyes. He'd stayed nearby throughout the day, ensuring she had everything she needed. His dedication went beyond duty. It showed genuine concern for her well-being. Sergeant Thomas appeared in the doorway, his tall frame casting a shadow in the dimming light. He approached her bed with measured steps, his expression kind. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his deep voice gentle. "Better," Emiko replied softly, surprising herself with how much she meant it. She wasn't just better physically. Something had shifted inside her. The fear that had been her constant companion since arriving at the camp had begun to fade. The warmth of the medical unit, the steady presence of Private Harris, and the caring attention of the staff created an atmosphere she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since arriving at Camp McCoy, Emiko felt truly safe. It wasn't just the medicine that had healed her. It was the humanity she'd witnessed throughout the day. The morning sun filtered through the barracks windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Emiko sat on her bunk, her fingers twisting the thin blanket as she listened to the whispered conversations around her. The air felt heavy with worry. "I heard they're sending us to work in factories," Yuri whispered, her face pale with concern. "Just like before." Emiko's stomach tightened at the words. She watched as other women gathered in small clusters, their faces drawn with anxiety. The peaceful routine they'd established at Camp McCoy suddenly felt fragile, like morning frost that could melt away at any moment. "My cousin worked in a factory during the war." Another woman, Keiko added. She said the conditions were terrible. No rest, barely any. Food. Emiko stood up, needing to move, to do something with the nervous energy building inside her. She walked to the window, watching the American soldiers go about their morning duties. Private Harris was helping unload supplies from a truck, his movements steady and sure. How strange it was to see these men, these soldiers they'd been taught to fear, performing such ordinary tasks with such ordinary kindness. But the knot in her stomach wouldn't ease. What if all of this, the decent food, The medical care, the respectful treatment, was just temporary. What if it was all leading to something worse? Outside, she could see more trucks arriving. The sight made her anxiety spike. Were they here to transport them to these rumored work locations? Her hands gripped the windowsill tightly. "They say we'll be separated," came another whisper from behind her. "Some to farms, some to factories." The words sent a chill through Emiko's body. Separation meant vulnerability. It meant losing the small comfort of familiar faces, of shared experiences. She thought of how they'd supported each other through nightmares, through memories that threatened to overwhelm them. The door to the barracks opened, and Lieutenant Johnson stepped in. His presence, usually reassuring, now made Emiko's heart race with apprehension. She studied his face, trying to read his expression, looking for any sign of what was to come. "Miss Emiko," he said, his voice carrying its usual gentle authority. "May I speak with you?" She followed him outside, where the morning air was crisp and cool. Other soldiers were going about their duties, nodding respectfully as they passed. Lieutenant Johnson led her to a quiet spot near the medical unit. "I've heard about the rumors," he said, his dark eyes meeting hers directly. "About work camps and factories." Emiko's throat felt dry. "Are they true?" "No," he said firmly. "They're just rumors. You and the other women will remain here, under our protection. Any work will be voluntary, and you'll never be separated or sent away against your will." The relief that flooded through her was so strong it made her dizzy. Lieutenant Johnson must have noticed, because his expression softened. "We made a promise when you arrived," he continued, "to treat you with dignity and respect. That wasn't just words, Miss Emiko. We mean to keep that promise." Emiko looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet strength in his bearing. This man, who himself faced discrimination within his own army, stood before her offering reassurance and protection. Something shifted inside her, like a door slowly opening to let in light. The news spread through the barracks like a ripple in still water. They were being moved. Emiko sat on her bunk, watching the other women pack their few belongings into small bags. The familiar knot of anxiety that had been her constant companion for so many years tried to take hold, but something was different now. Lieutenant Johnson stood in the doorway, his posture relaxed as he explained their destination. "It's a larger facility," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle tone they'd grown accustomed to. "You'll have better quarters there, and proper work assignments." Emiko noticed how her fellow women nodded, some even offering small smiles. Just months ago, such news would have sent them into silent panic. But now, after experiencing the unexpected kindness of their American guards, particularly the black soldiers, the fear had been replaced by cautious acceptance. The journey began early the next morning. The military trucks were uncomfortable, but the soldiers had provided blankets against the autumn chill. Private Harris rode in their truck, occasionally translating instructions or offering water. Emiko watched the American countryside roll past. Endless fields and scattered forests, so different from her homeland. "You doing okay?" Private Harris asked during one of their stops, offering her a canteen. Emiko accepted it with a slight bow. "Yes, thank you." She had learned that his concern was genuine, not a pretense hiding darker intentions. The convoy traveled for hours. Some of the women dozed, while others whispered quietly among themselves. Emiko noticed how the soldiers maintained their respectful distance, yet remained attentive to their needs. It was a strange comfort, this new normal where dignity was given freely. As they approached their destination, Emiko saw the high fences of another camp come into view. But what caught her attention were the figures moving within, men in familiar uniforms, Japanese soldiers. Her breath caught for a moment, old memories threatening to surface. The trucks rolled through the gates, and Emiko watched as Japanese prison of wars worked alongside American guards, their interactions marked by the same respectful distance she had grown accustomed to. Some were tending to a vegetable garden, others were carrying supplies between buildings. None showed signs of mistreatment or abuse. A group of Japanese officers walked past their truck, escorted by a single American guard. They walked with their heads held high, their dignity intact despite their prisoner status. Emiko saw how they were addressed with proper military courtesy, their rank still acknowledged even in defeat. As they disembarked, Sergeant Thomas approached with several Japanese-speaking interpreters. "Welcome to Camp Ellis," he said through one of them. "You'll find many of your countrymen here. All of them, like you, are under the protection of the Geneva Convention. Emiko stood with her small bag, taking in the scene around her. Here were their supposed enemies, the Japanese soldiers who had once commanded such fear and respect, living under the same rules, receiving the same treatment as she and her fellow women had experienced. The realization settled over her like a warm blanket. The American soldiers' kindness. It wasn't special treatment. It wasn't a trick or temporary measure. What she was witnessing was simply how they treated all their prisoners, with a fundamental respect for human dignity that transcended nationality, rank, or past actions. In that moment, standing in the dust of Camp Ellis, Emiko understood something profound about the nature of true strength and honor. The morning sun painted long shadows across the camp as Emiko walked toward the medical unit. Her steps were lighter now, different from the hesitant shuffling of her first days. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine needles and wood smoke from the camp's kitchen. Private Harris greeted her with a friendly nod as she entered. "Morning, Emiko. We've got new supplies to sort today." "Good morning," she replied, her voice clear and steady. The words no longer stuck in her throat like they used to. She picked up a clipboard and began checking inventory, her movements purposeful and confident. Throughout the morning, Emiko worked alongside the other women, directing them with gentle authority. When a new shipment of bandages arrived, she organized the distribution efficiently, something that would have terrified her just months ago. During lunch break, she sat with her fellow workers in the mess hall. The familiar sounds of metal trays and quiet conversation filled the air. Sergeant Thomas passed by their table, and Emiko found herself engaging in casual conversation about the changing weather. "The winters here are harsh," he explained, "but the medical unit is always warm." Emiko nodded, remembering how she once would have shrunk from such an exchange. Now, she felt comfortable enough to ask questions about winter preparations and even share stories about winters in her homeland. In the afternoon, she helped train 2 new arrivals in proper sterilization techniques. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she demonstrated the procedures. The new women watched her with the same fearful eyes she once had, but she saw them gradually relax as they worked together. "You see?" she told them in Japanese. "The work here is important. We help people heal." The words surprised her, not just their meaning but the strength behind them. Later, while organizing medical records, she overheard 2 soldiers discussing recent news from the Pacific Front. Instead of the familiar spike of anxiety, she felt a strange calm. The war seemed increasingly distant from this place of order and purpose. As evening approached, Lieutenant Johnson appeared in the doorway of the medical unit. "Emiko, could I have a word?" She followed him to his office, noting how she no longer felt the need to look over her shoulder or brace herself for bad news. The office was small but neat, with a desk and 2 chairs. Maps covered one wall, and a small window looked out over the campgrounds. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. Emiko settled herself, back straight but relaxed. "Lieutenant." Johnson's expression was serious but kind. The same look she'd come to trust over these months. "There's something I need to discuss with you," he began, folding his hands on the desk. "We've received word that the war, it's coming to an end." The words hung in the air between them. Emiko felt her heart skip a beat, then resume its steady rhythm. She clasped her hands in her lap, studying them as thoughts raced through her mind. Thoughts of home, of the future, of leaving this unexpected sanctuary. I understand," she said quietly, though her mind whirled with questions about what would come next. The safety she had found here suddenly felt precarious, like ice beginning to crack underfoot. Lieutenant Johnson leaned forward slightly. "I wanted to tell you personally. Changes are coming, but you should know that whatever happens, you've earned respect here. That won't change." Emiko nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Fear and hope warred within her. Fear of the unknown future, but also hope for what might be possible in a world where kindness had proven stronger than hatred. The news rippled through the camp like a gentle wave. The war was over. Emiko stood in the yard, watching as other women embraced each other, some crying, others silent with shock. The morning sun cast long shadows across the campgrounds, and the usual bustle of activity had given way to a strange stillness. Private Harris had delivered the news during breakfast, his face beaming with joy. But as he explained that they would soon return to Japan, Emiko felt her stomach tighten. The thought of going home stirred a mix of emotions she hadn't expected. She walked slowly through the camp, touching the wooden walls of the barracks where she had first learned to sleep without fear. The medical unit where she had worked alongside Lieutenant Johnson stood quiet, its windows reflecting the morning light. Each familiar sight brought memories of small kindnesses, a gentle word, a helping hand, a moment of respect that had helped rebuild her sense of worth. "Miss Emiko?" Lieutenant Johnson's voice broke through her thoughts. He stood at the entrance to his office, his uniform as crisp as always. "Do you have a moment?" She nodded and followed him inside. The office was small but tidy, with a desk and 2 chairs. Maps covered one wall, and sunlight streamed through the single window. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. "I wanted to speak with you before the preparations for departure begin." Emiko sat down, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "I am grateful for your time, Lieutenant. These past months," he began, his voice steady and kind. "You've shown remarkable courage, not just in your work, but in your willingness to trust again." He pulled out a piece of paper from his desk drawer. "I've written something for you." Her eyes widened as he handed her the letter. The paper was official-looking, with the camp's letterhead at the top. "This is a letter of recommendation," he explained. "It speaks of your character, your work in the medical unit, and the strength you've demonstrated here." Emiko's vision blurred with tears as she read the words. Miss Emiko has proven herself to be a person of exceptional character and resilience. Through her actions and attitude, she has demonstrated the very best of human dignity and strength. "Lieutenant," she whispered, "I don't deserve such kind words." "You do," he said firmly. "When you arrived, you were afraid. We all saw it. But you chose to trust, to learn, to grow. That takes more courage than many people possess." Emiko carefully folded the letter, her hands shaking slightly. "I was taught to fear American soldiers especially." She paused, then continued softly. "Especially black soldiers. But you and your men showed me what true dignity looks like." Lieutenant Johnson smiled, a gentle expression that had become familiar over the months. "Sometimes the best way to fight hatred is with kindness." He stood up and extended his hand. "I wish you well, Miss Emiko." She stood, and after a moment's hesitation, took his hand. "Thank you, Lieutenant, for everything." As she walked toward the door, she stopped and turned back. "When I return to Japan, I will remember this place not as a prison, but as where I learned to be free again." The lieutenant nodded, understanding in his eyes. Through the window, they could hear the sounds of the camp coming back to life as the women began their preparations for departure. The ship's gentle sway had become familiar over the weeks-long journey back to Japan. Emiko stood at the railings, watching the coastline of her homeland emerge from the morning mist. The sight of Mount Fuji in the distance made her heart flutter with a mixture of joy and apprehension. "It looks different somehow," she whispered to herself, her hands gripping the cold metal. The familiar peaks and valleys of her homeland seemed unchanged. Yet she felt like a stranger approaching these shores. Around her, the other women huddled in small groups, their faces reflecting the same uncertainty she felt. They had left Japan as prisoners, as comfort women, a term that still made her throat tighten, but they were returning as something else entirely. The kindness they had experienced at Camp McCoy had transformed them in ways that were hard to explain. Emiko touched the pocket of her coat, feeling the letter Lieutenant Johnson had given her. The paper had become worn at the edges from how often she'd unfolded and read it during the journey. His words about her strength and dignity had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder that she was more than her past. As they disembarked, the bustling port of Yokohama felt both familiar and strange. The war had left its mark. Buildings were damaged, people moved about with a weariness that spoke of long suffering, but there was also a sense of renewal in the air, of people picking up the pieces of their lives. "What will you do now?" asked Yuri, one of the women who had become close to Emiko during their time at Camp McCoy. Her voice was barely audible above the noise of the port. Emiko straightened her shoulders, remembering Private Harris's gentle encouragement whenever she had doubted herself. "I will speak the truth," she said, her voice stronger than she expected, "about what we experienced, about the kindness we were shown." In the following days, as the women settled back into their communities, Emiko found herself doing exactly that. At first, it was in quiet conversations with family members who were stunned to hear her speak of American soldiers, particularly black soldiers, with such warmth and respect. She told them about Sergeant Thomas's dignified presence, about Private Harris's compassionate care when she was ill, about Lieutenant Johnson's unwavering respect. "But we were taught they were monsters," her cousin had said one evening, confusion evident in her voice. "We were taught many things," Emiko replied, thinking of her own transformation. "But kindness speaks louder than any teachings of hate." Word spread through her neighborhood about the woman who had returned from America with stories that contradicted everything they had believed about their former roommate. Enemies. Some dismissed her words as propaganda, but others listened with growing interest. In local gatherings, Emiko shared her experiences. The warm meals they were given, the dignity with which they were treated, the way the black soldiers, who faced discrimination themselves, had shown them that humanity could transcend the boundaries of race and war. She spoke of the day Private Harris had stayed by her bedside when she was ill, of Lieutenant Johnson's letter that acknowledged her humanity, of Sergeant Thomas's quiet strength that had made them feel safe. Each story she shared was a small bridge being built, connecting two worlds that had once seemed impossibly far apart. The transformation she had undergone at Camp McCoy continued to reshape her life in Japan. The shame and fear that had once defined her began to fade, replaced by a quiet strength born from the unexpected kindness she had received. The auditorium buzzed with quiet murmurs as Emiko adjusted the microphone. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly pinned back, and her hands, though wrinkled with age, remained steady as she arranged her notes. The young faces before her reminded her of herself at their age, full of questions about the world and its complicated history. "When I was young," she began, her voice clear and strong despite her years, "I believed in walls. Walls between people, between nations, between hearts." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd of high school students. "The war taught us to fear, to hate. But sometimes, life's greatest lessons come from the most unexpected places." The projector behind her clicked, showing a black and white photograph of Camp McCoy. The image brought back memories so vivid she could almost feel the Wisconsin winter wind on her face. "This was where I learned about kindness," she said, pointing to the barracks, "where I discovered that humanity exists even in the darkest times." She told them about Private Harris, who had given her medicine when she was sick, and Lieutenant Johnson, whose quiet dignity had helped her see beyond her prejudices. Her voice grew warm with emotion as she described the black soldiers who had protected them, defying everything she had been taught to believe. "They could have treated us with hatred," she continued. "They had every reason to. But instead, they showed us compassion. They taught us that dignity isn't something that can be taken away. It can only be given up." A young girl raised her hand. "Weren't you scared?" she asked. Emiko nodded slowly. "Every day, at first, fear was all I knew. But that's the thing about kindness. It's stronger than fear. It breaks down walls we think are unbreakable." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a worn piece of paper. Lieutenant Johnson's letter of recommendation. The edges were frayed, but the words remained clear. "This letter," she said, holding it up, "reminded me that we are all human, all capable of both receiving and giving kindness." The students leaned forward as she read a portion. She proved the humanity of her people and the strength of her spirit. "These words changed my life. They showed me that our past doesn't have to define our future." Emiko smiled at the sea of young faces before her. Some were taking notes, others sat in rapt attention. In their eyes, she saw hope for the future, a generation that might learn from the past without being bound by it. Today, as a mother and grandmother, I share this story not to dwell on the pain of war, but to show how kindness can transform lives. Those soldiers at Camp McCoy didn't just protect us, they showed us a different way to live. They proved that compassion knows no boundaries of race or nationality. She gestured to the photograph of Camp McCoy once more. "This place, which I once feared would be my prison, became my classroom in humanity. The lessons I learned there, about dignity, respect, and the power of unexpected kindness, these are the gifts I pass on to you." In the front row, a young man wiped away tears. Others nodded thoughtfully, their faces reflecting the impact of her words. Emiko felt the weight of her years, but also the lightness that came with sharing her truth. The story of Camp McCoy wasn't just about war and suffering. It was about the triumph of human kindness over hatred, of hope over fear. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.